There was an honor killing in a suburb of Dallas. An Egyptian cab driver father murdered his daughters that he had had with his divorce.
I remember that, yeah.
Well, I began to see, that was my first exposure as a young journalist. I'd been working for like 4 years. My first exposure to how the media curates stories. And I watched the whole LGBT gay marriage story play out over the next 10, 15, 20 years in the media to completely sanitize things, utterly. And it's not just about that. When I was in Dallas, I went to work at the Dallas Morning News from 2003 to late 2009. I'd come from New York City. I'd been there for 9/11. I had educated myself about radical Islam, the Muslim Brotherhood, how it had penetrated America. I get to Dallas and I find out there's a big problem there. An FBI source told me that this area in the U.S., it's the second biggest area for radical Islamic fundraising, was North Texas, behind the D.C. area, because there were so many engineers, Muslim engineers. So I started writing about the problems there, and I immediately hit a buzzsaw. The local Muslim community, CARE, Council of American Islamic Relations, they started complaining about that bigot Rod Dreher, and they would demand meetings with my editors to, how dare you, how dare you? And I had a great editor. I worked on the editorial page. She said, as long as you can back up what you're saying with facts, I've got your back. And she was true to her word, but we would have to sit there in meetings with these CARE people. How dare you? How dare you? I said, why are you teaching Sayyid Qutb at the mosque? Who is that? We don't know. Like, you're from Egypt. You know who he is. You know, the philosopher of radical
The head
Islam.
of the Muslim Brotherhood, yeah.
Muslim Brotherhood. And, but I saw the newsroom, this was the editorial page, the newsroom didn't want to touch it, did not want to touch it, because I think they thought anything that might make some Texas Baptist redneck think ill of Muslims, we don't want to have any part of that. And it came to a head like this. There was an honor killing in a suburb of Dallas. An Egyptian cab driver father murdered his daughters that he had had with his divorce.
I remember that, yeah.
Yeah, because they were dressed like sluts. So he killed them. And he was on the run from the FBI for 10 years. The Muslim community was hiding him. Anyway, I remember the day that they had their funeral of these murdered children at the Dallas Central Mosque, the biggest mosque in Texas at the time. I saw the reporter who the paper had sent to cover that. She came back to the newsroom and she was shaken. So what happened? She goes, I was at that funeral. Do you know what the imam's, who was Muslim Brotherhood, you know what his sermon was? He said, this only goes to show parents, control your daughters better. And I remember thinking, that's not going to make it into the paper the next day. And it didn't. And along those lines, the London subway bombing, you remember that? It turned out to be local Muslim radicals in Britain. I was the delegate from the editorial page to the morning news meeting, which in newspapers is where various editors decide, all right, what's on the agenda? What are we working on for tomorrow's paper? And the subway bombing had just happened and we were all scrambling. Is there a local angle? I said, well, yeah, I think this is going to prove to be homegrown in Britain. They've got a big problem with this. A lot of the same teachers that are informing radicalization in the UK, we've got that same school here in North Texas. Guy sitting on my right, super liberal newsroom guy, he said, why do we always have to talk about radical Islam? Why are we not talking about Jerry Falwell and some of these right-wing?
Oh my God.
To his credit, one of my gay colleagues at the other end of the table said, this is not the same thing. Come on. But the fact that this liberal's visceral reaction to like immediately turn something around Islamic violence, mass murder of people, into an argument about Christianity. I mean, it tells you where a lot of this comes from.
Yeah, and speaking of journalism, I've reached a point, and it's almost like an epistemological, just conclusion I've reached, which is because of all these lies from journalists, and who was it, Trump, who made it famous, fake news, and it's a real thing. Obviously, you've just described it, and I think it's worse and worse. It's I call it an epistemological problem because we've reached a point where I personally don't know what to believe anymore. I can watch a news show about an event and it will portray it in one way, and then I'll watch another news show and it's 180 degrees, And and I think this is kind of a crisis. It's like, how can we,
It's a huge crisis.
as citizens and voters, we're supposed to rely on the media and and journalists to bring us something up and some semblance of reality. And I think it's open now that no, everyone has an axe to grind, everyone has an agenda, and it could be the government, it could be the U.S. government, it could be the opposition, or even here in Europe as well. So how do you, as a journalist, how do you what do you say to that? What do we do?
Well, and for most of my career in newsrooms, we had to increase diversity, but it was a sham diversity. We had blacks, whites, Asians, Indians, Latinos.
That doesn't help with truth, you know?
But everybody held the same political views. Everybody went to the same universities, right? So it was a sham diversity. They had no interest in going to Christian universities, for example. Everybody was middle class, no working class people. In any case, that's American journalism. But more broadly speaking, there's a crisis of authority in our society. The internet has been great in some ways because it's made the way for voices like yours to be heard and get a wide hearing. And I'm grateful for that. I wouldn't want to go back to what we had before. At the same time, there's so many competing voices that nobody really knows what to believe in. And you know what this is a lot like? Weimar Germany, which is to say Germany between the end of the First World War and the rise of Hitler. My next book is called Weimar America, and it's based on this, comparing Germany in the 1920s to America in the 2020s. Now, no, this is not a Trump is Hitler book. I mean, I've supported Trump, for better or for worse. I don't think he's Hitler. But it's more about how we have recreated in America today the psychosocial conditions of 1920s Germany. Germany got there through trauma. It lost the war, which destroyed the authority of a lot of German institutions. Then they had hyperinflation in 1923, which wiped out the middle class. And even then, the Nazis were, by 1928, they were only at 2.6% in the national vote. Next year comes the Great Depression, and the centrist parties in parliament didn't know what to do about it. 1930 election, the Nazis went from 2.6% to 18.7%. 2 years later, unemployment is 40%. The Nazis became the biggest party in the German parliament. In 1933, Hitler took over, and that was that. Now, what's the parallel here? Germany was so liquid and unstable, German society in the 20s, not only economically, but morally. When we think of Berlin, Weimar Berlin, we think of the prostitution, the transgenderism, a lot of drug use. I mean, Berlin became the sex tourist capital of Europe. And it was shocking, the things I read. They had child brothels. All right. That's how bad it was. And eventually that gave way. I mean, the people, I found this interesting. The demographic that ran hardest and fastest to Hitler in the Great Depression at the beginning were young, educated, middle-class men. Because these were men who were too young to fight in the war. And they had grown up in this culture where nobody knew what was true. They had 3,000 newspapers, left-wing, right-wing, whatever. Nobody knew what was true. All the traditional authorities, the church, whatever, had been wrecked by the war. And they were terrified, and then they were just starting to put it back together when the Depression came. And these young people were just so filled with anxiety. Hitler offered them a way out of their fear and anxiety. They saw, we have no future with democracy. I fear that we are heading that way now. And another thing Hitler did, he said that he told them the cause of your problems are the Jews. Yeah, the French, the Allies, but the Jews. And if we just get rid of them, everything's going to be great. And when I see the rise of Jew hatred among the Zoomers, people in their 20s today, I'm like, it's so Weimar, even though we're not in the same economic suffering that Weimar Germans were in, we still live in a very precarious society. My kids are in their 20s, and I'm worried about what kind of job market they're going into. Their generation is without question going to live worse than my generation and every generation prior to theirs. And if if the AI predictions are true, Dario Amodei of Anthropic said earlier this year that AI is probably within the next 5 years going to wipe out half the white collar jobs. Dude, if that happens, we're in a revolution. Peter Turchin, historian who founded a branch of history called Cliodynamics, in which he applies quantitative analysis to historical events. He has said that the main driving factor in history of most revolutions has been elite overproduction. What does he mean by that? He means there have been too many educated people who aspire to join the ruling elite and not enough places for them. When these people see all the avenues closed off to them economically and otherwise, they revolt. And a lot of people think the working class, the masses, are the source of revolution. No, it's the elites, the educated elites who've turned against the system, who have the intelligence and the networks to mobilize the masses. This is like the Bolsheviks were all educated people.
No.
You know, there weren't enough middle-class educated people to overthrow the czar, but they knew how to mobilize people. I think we're going to find that in the U.S. if we're not careful. And I'm hoping my book will sort of wake people up and make people realize, you know, that we don't have to go the way of Weimar. But if we don't do something about it, not just about our economics, but about addressing the crisis of meaning and the social atomization, then we're destined to have some version of Weimar. It might not be Hitler 2.0.
Might be worse.
Or Stalin 2.0, but I think it's going to be more, if we get something like this, it's going to be more of an authoritarian, managed authoritarian society managed by AI and surveillance, social credit system.